Welcome back. In this segment, we're going to dive into some of the legal questions still being asked around impeachment, one of which is on timing and how long the House ought to take on impeachment, especially after the news this weekend raising new questions on the behaviors of Devin Nunes and Mick Mulvaney, and also the help that Nunes got from one of Rudy Giuliani's now indicted helpers, or why the process of moving along at all, considering you got key people like John Bolton, Mike Pompeo, Rick Perry, and others have yet to be deposed or even called to testify. Though there is an interesting legal theory going on out there as to why not calling them now may actually help Democrats in the long run. Now, this idea, it first came from a former federal prosecutor through the news site Talking Points memo, and it goes like this. Were the House to subpoena any of the big players right now before a Senate trial, those players would contest a subpoena in court, as we've already seen. It would likely be appealed to the Supreme Court, which means a ruling as late as this spring or summer. Now, that's obviously too slow for the impeachment process, which means they likely would never testify. But if subpoenas are issued during a Senate trial, those requests would come from House impeachment managers and would be ruled on by Chief Justice John Roberts, who would be presiding over that Senate trial. He, the thinking goes, would be more likely to grant the subpoenas and faster than a court would. The Senate, they could override Roberts with a vote, but those votes would have political consequences, so it's more likely than not that those witnesses would be heard in time, or so goes the theory. For more, let's turn to Stephen Mulroy. He, a constitutional law professor at the University of Memphis and a former federal prosecutor himself. All right, Stephen, wishful thinking, I read that and I'm saying the problem is this makes too much sense. Are you buying what I'm selling, or at least what that former federal prosecutor like yourself is selling?
Well, I read the same Talking Points memo article that you did around the same time, and I have to say that I found it persuasive. It does seem to me that if you have a Senate trial, then the prosecutors ought to be able to compel the testimony of witnesses, and the Constitution does say that the Chief Justice shall preside over the Senate impeachment trial, so you would think in the first instance Chief Justice Roberts would get to rule. I do agree with the analysis that if you made a credible case of relevant testimony, as I think applies in the names of the witnesses you just named, then I think Chief Justice Roberts would be inclined to rule in favor of compelling the testimony.
To that end, Stephen, I know people come at this from their own vantage points, but if you even generously say there's 20% of Americans who can be persuaded one way or the other, which is basically what our electorates come down to nowadays, we have not heard from some of the people that we should be hearing from. There are documents that haven't been turned over that we should know about that are relevant to this. And again, even if you don't take one side or the other, you want to have an informed electorate, or in this case, an informed set of jurors, theoretically, if you call the Senate jurors. At the end, do you feel that we're going to hear from these people and see these documents and read these transcripts? Or do you think it's going to be, four corners here, defense, we're going to run out the clock before politically they have to make up their mind?
They're certainly going to try to run a four corners defense and run out the clock. As to whether that will succeed or not, I think it largely depends on whether this, strategy that you and I just talked about a second ago with getting Justice Roberts to rule works or doesn't work. The only key piece of information really left in the case for impeachment over this Ukrainian deal is testimony from people who directly spoke to President Trump and who heard President Trump not only express interest in getting the two investigations done, that we already have, but specifically condition providing the military aid or the White House meeting on providing those investigations. We know that there was such a condition placed by lower level officials. We know that Trump was interested in these investigations, but putting the two together and having it tied directly to Trump from somebody who dealt directly with Trump is the key missing piece of information. And that's why some of these subpoenas are so important. Now, the interesting thing here is that the reason we don't have their testimony is that Trump himself has ordered them not to cooperate. And so it seems a little unfair to, on the one hand, say, I'm not going to let these witnesses testify, and then say, well, you can't convict me because you don't have their testimony. So I do think that it's valid for the House to say, we're going to draw a negative inference about that since you won't cooperate with us for this firsthand testimony, and then try like heck to get that firsthand testimony when they get to if they get to the Senate impeachment trial.
Stephen, I'm curious, using Watergate, I guess, as a guide, you know, I think with the rose-colored lens of history here, we tend to think of these heroic Republican lawmakers, you know, like the Bakers or the Thompsons, who were really out there to get to the truth. That was really late in the game. That said, though, they were at least willing to ask some of the questions when it became readily available that there was tapes here. We heard the testimony from Dean. I look at Devin Nunes. He's not prepared to answer the question if he had this Vienna meeting with some of the same cronies that Giuliani's palling around with obviously Ukrainian interests. I'm hearing Republican senators now that will be the triers of fact, if you will, these actually supposed to be this jury of 100, and they're saying they're not even going to listen to the testimony. Am I naive? Has this always been this partisan, or does it seem people just want to put their finger in their ears or close their eyes and pretend there's no there?
A little of each. I mean, you're right that a lot of the Republicans came over very late in the game when the evidence started really piling up and public opinion polls started really going south for Nixon, so it became a little bit easier to break ranks. But you're right, they did at least ask the questions. They did try to get to the bottom of it, at least somewhat. We don't see that as much in the current situation. With respect to Devin Nunes in particular, it seems like he should be disqualified from further participation in the impeachment hearings. I mean, he should recuse himself. And the fact that he didn't disclose these connections where he was flying around Europe trying to root out the same CrowdStrike, Ukraine did it, not Russia did it in 2016 conspiracy theory that's since been debunked, that he was personally involved in that. I think his failure to disclose that might even be an ethics violation, but certainly he should not be involved. So I think you are right, particularly the senators, like Senator Lindsey Graham says, I won't read the transcripts. Like a week or two after saying, well, if there's credible evidence of a quid pro quo, then I'd have to take that seriously. That's very suspicious. And senators who are saying, I'm not even going to listen to the testimony, I mean, that is a direct abdication of their responsibility under the Constitution to act as triers, the jury in the Senate impeachment trial. So I do think that yes, it's gotten more partisan, sad to say.
Hey, Stephen, thank you so much for the time. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Take care.
All right, everybody, when we come back, more on impeachment. This time we're going to focus on politics. Is either side benefiting from impeachment? Well, polls, they offer different opinions. And also, how can and should the Democrats campaign to replace Trump while Congress is trying to get rid of him? We're going to talk to a former Democratic congressman next.